Continuing our discussion that we started yesterday regarding the Anti Maimonidean Controversy and the crisis of Kabbalah in the Iberian Peninsula, especially in the 12th, actually in the 13th and 14th centuries leading up to 1391, and the great violence that affected 70 to 80 communities in the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. I wanted to continue by looking, or at least referencing, an article that was written by Rabbi Josef Faur. It was titled Anti Maimonidean Demons. And in it, Faur points out something quite simple, which is the mass apostasy of Iberian Jews, of course, took place after and not before the series of attacks on the Rambam and his philosophical perspectives. And one of the things that Faur points out is that this is something that is often ignored by individuals that are looking to place the blame on the philosophical tradition that was characteristic of much of Sephardic Jewry in the peninsula. And in many ways, one could even point out that the radical change that took place in the peninsula among Jewish leadership is actually something which is really consequential of the change in its attitude towards this Kabbalah that is coming in from France in particular, but obviously its approach to faith from a very different standpoint in terms of tolerance. And what Faur contends is that while we argue, or that individuals have argued that it's the philosophical tradition which weakened Judaism and Jewish belief, you can actually argue that it's really the Kabbalistic approach or the attitude that's adopted by the Kabbalist who import this Kabbalah, this particular form and attitude from France, in such a way that it actually reflects Christian approaches and attitudes towards philosophy and tolerance. And one of the things that Faur states, and I'll quote this, is unknowingly, the anti-Maimonideans promoted Christian theology. It should be emphasized that they were not conscious of their mental assimilation. Their opposition fostered the illusion of total autonomy, barring an analysis of the basic elements affecting their own thinking process. And I think the most controversial aspect of what Faur says is found in the following. He says, quote, a mark of the anti-Maimonidean ideology, whereby zeal displaces halakha as the most important aspect of Jewish life, is the sanction of violence as a legitimate means for the implementation of religion. And this, I think, is without question, I think cannot be argued, in my opinion. And he says, or we understand that among the principal characteristics of contemporary Christian society was the persecution of heterodox minorities. We see this in southern France in particular because of the rise of the Cathars in the 13th century. And as a consequence, persecution and in its form, the Inquisition in medieval France becomes a major tool for stamping out any kind of minority group that objects to the standards of the religious standards of the majority. Persecution becomes a major component of Christian theology, and in the context of the Jewish community, the anti-Maimonidean circles begin a process of harassing those Jews who conform to earlier notions of Jewish spirituality. In essence, what they do is they create a distinctive group which is to be persecuted and to be opposed, and then as a consequence, when they go to the church leaders to persecute these individuals, what they've done in actuality is adopt the positions and the attitudes that we see in France, for example, against the Cathars or the Albigensian heresy, or the Albigensians. And so Rabbi Faur states again, quote, one need not be particularly bright to have realized that requesting the Dominicans to burn Maimonides' works established an extremely dangerous precedent. And I think that really is, in many ways, encapsulates this idea that Faur contends, in essence, will replace halakha. Halakha is based on the idea that there are clearly defined categories of Jewish law. The mitzvot are those categories. They are specific ways that they are to be observed to fulfill, the mitzvot. The specific commandments must be fulfilled in accordance with a rabbinic understanding. But what essentially happens, according to Faur, is that we have the implementation and the adoption of something called ijtihad, which is zeal which in essence displaces the notion of halakha as the primary basis for Jewish life. And this itchechad, this zeal, begins to be the guiding light, one might say, or the drive toward religious uniformity. So anybody that is proclaiming in the intellectual tradition of old Sepharad, as Faur would say, in reality is to be opposed, and any means, whether it's violence, persecution, banishment, or cherem, is to be used to combat this. And this is a strikingly different approach than the communities of the Iberian Peninsula were used to. And I would say, in many ways, it's simply not reflective of a classical Jewish understanding. Now, one of the things that we learn is that the loss of creativity, the loss of the ability to think about things in a different way, is detrimental in a way that we don't really understand. Because this characteristic of creativity that was experienced by Jews under Islam was characteristic of the Jewish experience for centuries. And when they lose that, when they lose the ability to think openly, intellectual life is stifled. There's a dramatic effect that occurs because of the inability to be open about one's particular philosophical, scientific, humanistic inclinations. And instead, there must be uniformity with respect to the way that we think. And I think in many ways, even though we haven't really addressed it, I think maybe we see these elements in play today, where there's a harshness and an intolerance towards views that do not reflect a particular perspective. Now, you could argue that you can see these in the extremes of the Jewish community. You have individuals who are Haredi, who are fundamentalists, who will take a particular tack with respect to anything that doesn't support their particular view. But then if you go to the far progressive wing, you can actually see the same idea, where there's an intolerance and a view that there is only one approach to Jewish life, and it must be in accordance with the views and the perspectives that they embrace. And I think that this idea, even though we're talking specifically about the medieval period, is in many ways very enlightening to our day and age. And as we continue through the video series, we'll look at more examples of what happens and why there's this crisis of identity and faith that plagues the Jewish community in the 14th century and contributes to the catastrophe of 1391 and the aftershocks thereafter, because it doesn't just simply end in 1391. As I mentioned, there's a political, social, religious crisis that lasts 100 years or more in the peninsula, and it's focused in on the question of conversos, these individuals who have converted, but by extension, it's also focused in on the place of Jews in the environment and culture and society of Castilian and Aragonese life. And so, of course, that will come to a head in 1492, when the only option that is seen from the standpoint of the monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, is the eradication of open Jewish life, so that the conversos will, in essence, be saved, shall we say, or that Spain itself, Castile and Aragon, will be saved from the cancer of Judaizing. So again, we'll continue this thought as we progress through the video series.